Hey there, welcome to church. Have you ever been here before and wondered in the back of your mind, is any of this even real? Is there even actually a God? But then quickly caught yourself and apologized to God that you even had that thought? Have you ever sat through hundreds of half-hour sermons and either left church or have given up ever changing while you still listen to sermon after sermon? Have you ever wondered if it was possible to prove that the Bible was really from God and that he actually exists? If you have, a church is about to appear in front of us, and if you want answers, then follow me inside. After 15 minutes, we'll see if any of these questions are resolved for you. Okay, now bear with me for just a minute as we walk. The stuff I'm about to say will probably sound a little strange and won't make sense just yet, but stick with me. Just try to put yourself in this situation. Imagine you're given this incredibly intricate pattern with multiple steps and you're told to look for it within the Bible and to see if it fits anywhere. You're probably asking yourself, okay, but what's this pattern I'm hypothetically given? Well, here it is. Imagine you were told this. If you want, you can go ahead and pause to read each step, but I'll warn you, it's not really gonna make sense just yet. It'll make sense once we go through the stories I'm about to show you and check off each step in the pattern, explaining as we go. So, now, with that said, let's step through this door. The pattern all starts with what's on this table here. Imagine you were told that God does everything in sevens, but you didn't know what that meant, but you knew that 4 times in Revelation, God says there are 7 spirits of God. Imagine you were told that these 7 spirits, when rightly divided, form a tabernacle and also explains the 3 rooms of the tabernacle. Let's make it a little bigger so you can see. Starting from the left, there's the Holy of Holies, the Holy Place, and the outer court with man's world on the outside. Then imagine you were told that there are 4 stories in history that together explain why man continually rejects God when he comes to earth. The Garden of Eden, Cain and Abel, Moses in the cloud on the mountain, and Jesus in the Roman court. And finally, imagine you were told that within these 4 stories, there's a striking commonality amongst them all, a repeating pattern that can't be known on its own, but can only be revealed to you, no matter how simple the connection is after you see it. Now, let's head back to the Holy of Holies, where the first story takes place and where this repeating pattern begins. Welcome to the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve stand in innocence, making a choice between 2 things that God put before them. In the pattern, God always gives people a choice between a life thing and a death thing, which in this particular story is the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But before we move on, let's take this particular step back to the pattern so that you can follow along a little better for yourself. Number 4 was the same pattern will happen in each story, and this pattern started with what we just saw. God gives people 2 choices. As you can see, this is where we're headed next, so let's follow along. After Adam and Eve were given the choice, as we all know, they infamously picked the death choice, which the next step in the pattern is man rejects life choice and picks death choice. Now, after this choice, you might know that God guarded the tree of life, the life choice, with angels and a flaming sword turning every which way around the tree. But have you ever wondered why? Well, later on in the pattern, this image might make a little more sense to you. You'll see it's definitely not random. Continuing on in the pattern, after the death choice is picked, man gets kicked out of the location of the choice and into a new land. For Adam and Eve, of course, they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, the flaming tree of life being the last thing they saw as they left. Now, in the pattern, when God kicks man out of his presence and into this new land, God always instructs or gives him something. And this proverbial something has 3 properties. We'll go through these now. For Adam, God instructed him to do one thing as he was kicked out of the garden. God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from whence he was taken. God told him that out in the new land, he was going to have to till the ground for food. Food wasn't just going to come easily to him anymore. Now, it was going to be hard work. In actuality, it's what man needs to survive in the place he's sent. So in our example, this tilling tool that Adam gains here as he's leaving is representative of that one instruction that God said to him, the one thing God gave him as he left: tilling. And interestingly, if you think about it, you could say that tilling is, in reality, what started the tree of life itself, the life choice. Hallelujah! After all, God planted the Garden of Eden, and accordingly, to plant something, you need to work the soil. Now, I'm not saying that God physically tilled the ground or anything. I mean, maybe he did, maybe he didn't, I don't know, but what I am saying is that that's the natural order of things: tilling, then seeding, then upkeeping. So that brings us back to the pattern. The thing man's given is the thing that started the life choice man rejected. Now, just for a second, do something for me, alright? It's gonna sound weird, but right now, just for a second, forget everything you know about God and the Bible in your present context. Everything you know about Jesus and about any story in the Bible, forget it all right now, and just put yourself in Adam's shoes, okay? Because to Adam, none of that even exists, because it hasn't happened yet. He only knows what God's told him, and of course, to him, God's told him everything. Think about where Adam's at this point, and what he personally knows in his context. What does he know right now? Well, if you think about it, all he pretty much knows is that he picked the tree that brought him death when he should have picked the tree that brought him eternal life, and he's constantly reminded of that wrong choice every time he sweats and is fatigued from working, feeling the effects of death. But he knows that every time he eats of the fruit of his labor, he feels rejuvenated, and in a way, he feels life again. Now he realizes why life is in the tree and in the fruit, because as he works hard and fatigues while tilling, eating the fruit of his labor is what brings life back into his body. Each time he eats, he gets close to the feeling in the garden, but never really reaches it. He now accepts that God was right, and that the tree of life is the only thing he could have done to give him eternal life. Now, with that said, let's move on to the final property. Now, this last property of the thing man's given is very interesting, but to understand it, we're gonna have to go to a well-known story in the Bible, Cain and Abel. This story is special because not only is it specifically an example of the third property of the thing you're given, but more broadly, it also describes how and why humankind falls every time God has come and given us a choice. If you really think about it, this story seems pretty backwards, right? I mean, you have two characters here. Two characters the Bible is sure to draw a very clear distinction between right from the start. Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. So you have two contrasting characters. Cain, who is very clearly identified as a tiller of the ground, the job God instructed him and his family to do after they were kicked out of the garden. And then you have Abel here, who is very clearly contrasted to his brother as someone who is not tilling, who is doing something very different. He's identified as a keeper of sheep, which is to identify him as someone doing something that God never instructed them to do after he kicked them out of the garden. Remember, when they were kicked out, the only thing God instructed them to do was to till the ground. So of course, when God calls both of them to give an offering to him, right now in Cain's mind, what do you think he's anticipating to happen here? Who do you think he thinks should be rebuked? I mean, look at Abel. He's seemingly giving the most random offering, the fat of his sheep, while Cain, on the other hand, is prepared to offer what God instructed them to produce in the new land, the fruit that came from tilling. Honestly, Cain must have been scared that his brother was about to get struck downright because of his rebellion. Ouch. I mean, if you think about it, Abel was doing something far worse than just simply rebelling, because to truly fatten sheep, you have to feed them actual crop, other than just having them graze on grass in a field. So again, to Cain, not only is his brother Abel directly disobeying God, but he's also destroying the crops that God instructed them to produce to give them life. For that reason, Cain knows for a fact that he himself will be praised for his offering, while Abel, on the other hand, will be rebuked. Ouch. But to his complete shock, when the offerings take place, the exact opposite thing happens. God rejects Cain's crop offering, but accepts the fat of Abel's sheep, the fat which is the representation of the culmination of all the crops that Abel has been rebelliously destroying. Cain is of course fuming because the guy who is doing the wrong thing is praised when the one who followed God's word perfectly is rebuked. So in short, Cain kills his brother Abel in a field with tilling. Now, this tilling tool Cain kills Abel with here is just representation of the idea that Cain killed Abel because of tilling. In other words, tilling became his god. So if we go back to the pattern, we see that the third property of the thing man's given is man makes a god of the thing he was given and will use it to test, reject, or kill God with when God returns. In Cain's case here, he rejected God by killing his brother with tilling. But the question still remains, of all the things Abel could have offered God, why in the world did he bring a sheep, and more specifically, a fattened sheep? Well, let's bring back our little folder here and save this image for later. It'll make sense soon. After this rejection of God takes place, a long period of time goes by in the new land, but God will return. And interestingly, as we'll see, the way he comes back is always very consistent. God always comes back to one man in a fire and tree to announce his return for a new choosing time. In other words, God comes to a single man to announce that soon he's going to offer himself again to all his children, like he offered himself to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. So as we can see here in this scene, while a man named Moses is tending his flock of sheep one day, God announces his return to him by revealing himself as a bush or tree that's burning but not consumed in the flames. But if you think about it, how did Moses know that this spirit was truly the God of the Hebrews? I mean, to us, God comes in a random burning bush, does a few miracles, says, "I am that I am," and Moses believes him.
Okay.
Well, if you really take a look at this experience that God puts Moses through here, it's a lot more intentional than it seems. Just look. Doesn't it remind you of something? If you don't see it yet, let's pull out our trusty folder here and compare something real quick. Now does it look familiar? God set the stage of the Garden of Eden by coming back to Moses as a picture of the guarded tree of life, the choice that Adam and Eve were banned from, the choice that God had been in. And not only that, but as Moses stood there in the midst of his sheep, reminiscent of Abel's life, God proceeded to walk Moses through the garden story itself, through the miracles he instructed Moses to do for the Hebrews in order to prove to them he had actually met God. But before starting these miracles, God told Moses to take off his shoes because he was standing on holy ground, a way of reminding Moses of the holiness of the Garden of Eden and the nakedness of Adam and Eve's bodies. Then God told Moses to cast his staff down onto the ground, and he turned it into a snake, reminiscent of the fact that Adam and Eve had the tree of life within their grasp, but chose to listen to the serpent instead. But then God told Moses to pick the snake up, and it turned back into his staff, this being metaphoric of the fact that God's children will have the tree of life back within their grasp if they choose it. After that, Moses' hand was turned leprous and then healed when he put it in and out of his cloak, representing the sickness that was to be found in the new land Adam and Eve were sent into after sinning. And lastly, God told Moses that when he poured water onto the ground, it would be turned into blood, a call back to the blood that was shed in the field when Cain killed his brother Abel. In this way, by immersing Moses in the garden story itself, God took Moses back to the last choosing time to prove to him that the God of the Hebrews was about to institute a new choosing time for all of his children. But before we move on, let's save this picture. It'll come in handy later. So while Moses is up on the mountain with his sheep, a representation of Abel, the rest of the Israelites are back in Egypt, representing Cain. They're working the ground, producing brick for Pharaoh's kingdom, eventually even being forced to gather their own straw after Moses confronts Pharaoh about setting the Israelites free. Now these tilling tools the Israelites are using here are just representation of the fact that they, in fact, are the ones working the ground in some way, as Cain himself was working the ground in some way. After this, the plagues fall on Egypt, God parts the Red Sea, and they're on their way to Mount Sinai to meet God. And this leads us to the part of the pattern I haven't shown you yet, but it's the most important part in knowing God. If you think about it, anyone could come up to you and say, "Hey, I'm God, pick me, follow me, do what I say." But how would you know if it was actually God? Well, this is the part of the pattern that will show you if it's God or not. Only God will be able to complete this next step. God will always fill the thing you were given, and He'll be in the thing you chose the last time. To refresh your memory, Adam was given instructions to till the ground, and Adam and Eve chose the knowledge of good and evil. So with this in mind, let's see what happens next. While the Israelites are on their multi-day journey to Mount Sinai, they obviously get hungry but can't grow crops while they're moving, so God provides them with food instead. In this way, God fills their need to till and produce their own food by providing food from heaven in the form of manna and quail. And when God offers Himself to the Israelites, He presents Himself to them as a terrifying, kingdom-destroying cloud on a mountain filled with thunder, lightning, and tremendous quaking while speaking the Ten Commandments, the ultimate knowledge of good and evil, you could say. So now we're finally through the entire pattern one time through, so let's see how it repeats itself in the stories to come. Step A is God gives people two choices, a life thing and a death thing. So let's head back to the holy place and see how this step takes place. Welcome to Mount Sinai, where the Israelites are standing in their own self-awareness, fearful of what is before them, making a choice between a life thing and a death thing, which in this particular story is a kingdom-destroying, thunderous, quaking cloud on a mountain speaking the Ten Commandments, and a good man, a prophet to Israel, the God-man to Pharaoh, the man himself, Moses. Now, you might be thinking, what choice are you talking about with Moses? You're calling Moses a death choice? What? To answer, what I would tell you for now is go back and read Exodus 19 and 20. In there, it's clear that God told Moses to cleanse and prepare the Israelites for 3 days to have a special encounter with God where all His people would finally hear God speak for the first time, instead of having Moses as the mediator between God and the Israelites. In this very important encounter, God chose to speak and reveal Himself to all His people at once as a terrifying cloud on a mountain. If you're still not convinced after reading those chapters, just at least follow my train of thought for now. Later on in this video, and in subsequent videos, you'll see how everything points back to the specific time in history as a designated choosing time. So, with that said, after the Israelites were given the choice, they picked none other than, you guessed it, the death choice, which the next step in the pattern is, man rejects life choice and picks death choice. Let's read the excerpt where this choice takes place. And all the people saw the thunderings and the lightnings and the noise of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, and when the people saw it, they removed and stood afar off. And they said unto Moses, Speak thou with us, and we will hear, but let not God speak with us, lest we die. And Moses said unto the people, Fear not, for God is come to prove you, and that His fear may be before your faces, that ye sin not. And the people stood afar off, and Moses drew near unto the thick darkness where God was. If that's not rejecting someone when they come to talk to you, I don't know what is. Maybe killing him, perhaps? But, oh wait, yeah, that'll come later. So far, the first time God's people chose wrong, they chose to be like God. The second time, they chose just a man, and hang on, the third time, it gets worse. So after they reject God, man gets kicked out of the location of the choice and into a new land. For the Israelites, they have to leave the mountain of God, and God will no longer speak directly to the people as a whole. Ye have dwelt long enough in this mount, turn you and take your journey. Now, if you remember, in the pattern, when God kicks man out of His presence and into this new land, God always instructs or gives him something. And this proverbial something has 3 properties. We'll go through these now. For the Israelites, God gave them all the laws and the government structure to survive as 6 million people in a new land. I mean, think about it. They've lived as slaves their whole lives under the iron fist of Pharaoh. So for God to keep them alive as a society after being set free, He had to give them laws and a government system so that they could survive. In actuality, it's what man needs to survive alive in the place he's sent. And interestingly, if you think about it, you could say that laws and government are, in reality, what started the powerful, kingdom-destroying cloud on the mountain, the life choice. Hallelujah! After all, God's kingdom in heaven defeated Pharaoh's kingdom on earth, and accordingly, to have a kingdom, you have to have laws and government. I mean, that's the natural order of things, right? Laws and government are the foundation of any kingdom, and God's kingdom was on the mountain in the form of a cloud. So if we go back to the pattern, the second property is, it's the thing that started the life choice man rejected. In this case, laws and government started God's kingdom that was on Mount Sinai. Now, with this something that man is given, in this case the law and government system represented here by the stone tablets and the tabernacle, man makes a quote-unquote god of it. In other words, he makes a god of the thing he was given when it was only given to him to keep him alive in the new land because he rejected God. We'll see in a minute how man used the law and government system to test, reject, and kill God when God returned. Although I bet you can already kind of guess, right? So if we go back to the pattern, we see that the third property of the thing man's given is, man makes a god of the thing he was given and will use it to test, reject, or kill God with when God returns. After man is given what he's given, a long period of time goes by in the new land, but God will return. And interestingly, as we've seen with Moses and the burning bush, God comes back to one man in a fire and tree to announce his return for a new choosing time. In other words, God comes to a single man to announce that soon he's going to offer himself again to all his children, like he offered himself to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and to the Israelites on Mount Sinai. But when did this fiery tree meeting happen again, you're asking? Well, right here. Meet Zacharias. If you don't know who Zacharias is, he's John the Baptist's father who worked as a priest in the temple. But before John the Baptist was conceived, Zacharias was in the temple burning incense at the altar of incense as was his priestly duty. As he was burning the incense, an angel of the Lord appeared before him on the right side of the altar of incense and announced to him that he would have a son named John the Baptist who would prepare the hearts of the people for the return of the Lord. Now, I know that this isn't exactly a big tree on fire like you might have been expecting. But before you just write this off, think about the parallels here. God again came to a single man in a burning quote-unquote tree, if you can kind of see what I'm saying. And not only that, but God managed to do it in a way that immersed Zacharias in the setting and story of the last time mankind rejected God, which, if you remember, is exactly what God did with Moses when he came to him in the burning bush. God immersed him in the setting and story of the last time man rejected him, which in that case was the Garden of Eden. This time, however, instead of telling Zacharias to remove his shoes and then turning a staff into a snake, all signs of events in the Garden of Eden, God surrounded Zacharias with signs of the next time God's children rejected him. The story of Moses and the Israelites. For example, after the Israelites rejected God on the mountain, they were given the tabernacle as part of the law and government to keep them alive in the new land. And this tabernacle is exactly where God meets Zacharias. And not only that, but God meets him in the room in which the previous choice was made. This will make sense more in subsequent videos, but just know that in the big tabernacle view here, the people rejected God on the mountain in the holy place, which is where Zacharias was physically standing when God met with him. And to get even more detailed, God chose to meet with Zacharias not only while he was standing in the holy place, but also while he was at the altar of incense, which it's known for its cloud of smoking sweet aroma that it gives as it burns. A call back to the smoking, burning mountain that God appeared on in front of the Israelites. And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. This time, however, the smell of the smoke is pleasant and sweet, a note to the fact that what was on the mountain was actually pleasant. The similarities don't stop there. When Zacharias begins to reject God after God tells him his elderly wife will become pregnant, God then makes Zacharias mute until his son is born. If you think about it, this is actually the exact reversal of what happened on Mount Sinai with the Israelites. The Israelites rejected God and told him to silence, but this time in the temple, God told the person rejecting him to silence. In these two stories, the commonality is that someone is being quieted. To make one more connection, it's also interesting that at the burning bush with Moses, Moses expresses to God that he's slow to speech, and in this story, God makes Zacharias slow to speech. Now, let's move on, but first, let's save this picture. It'll come in handy later. If you remember, the next step in the pattern is the step that lets you know if it's really God when he returns for a new choosing time. That way we can avoid this guy.
Hi there!
Only God can complete this next step. God will always fill the thing you were given, and he'll be in the thing you chose the last time. To refresh your memory, the Israelites were given the law and government system, which included the tabernacle, and instead of choosing God on the mountain, they chose a good, godly man. So with this in mind, let's see what happens next. After Zacharias' encounter with God, the Holy Spirit comes over Mary and starts Jesus inside of her. Jesus is eventually born, God tells some shepherds the news, and the Magi follow the star in heaven to find Jesus and bring him gifts. Then the only story of Jesus as a kid takes place. When Jesus is 12 years old, he goes missing and his parents can't find him anywhere, but 3 days later, they finally find him in the temple where Jesus asks why they were searching for him and tells them he must be in the temple where his father is. Next, Jesus is baptized and the voice of God says for all those around to hear, "This is my son in whom I am well pleased." Immediately after, Jesus begins his ministry. One time in particular while teaching, Jesus stood on a mountain and began to say what we now know as the Sermon on the Mount. Basically, this is where Jesus adds to the law, telling everyone that they've heard it said, insert law, but I tell you, insert new addition to the law. In other words, Jesus adds to their quote-unquote Bible of the day. He adds to the law. So you're probably thinking, okay, so with Jesus' life here that you just laid out, explain how he fills the given and is in the chosen? And to this proverbial question, I'd say, sure. So to start, people all the time wonder why there's only one story recorded of Jesus as a kid. There's only one, and it's the story that I said of him running away from his parents to the temple, and the temple is really just a larger scale, permanent version of the tabernacle. But if you think about it through this perspective I'm trying to convey here, doesn't it just kind of make sense that this is the first recorded cognitive decision Jesus ever made? And the only story of him as a kid? He runs away from his parents to the temple to be with his father. Not to mention, Jesus directly calls his body the temple in John 2:19 when he says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up," referring to himself. Now, Jesus fills the tabernacle in many, many more ways that I'll explain in other videos, but for now, this is the precursor to it all.